Max Schrems, founder of noyb, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks.
We're really interested to talk to you about the theJPA.club, which is a networking and supportive group for junior privacy advisors. And I'd want to speak to you a little bit about your journey in privacy, so that it might be helpful for those who are thinking of starting on their career in this area, or who've already started and are wondering where it might end up. So I wanted to start with asking, in relation to the beginning of your career, what inspired you? Did you fall into privacy like some of us did, or did you always know that was the area you wanted to be in?
I think that more happened. There were a couple of factors at the time. That was still post 9/11 a bit, like the 10 years thereafter, where suddenly new surveillance laws came up, and I started studying at the university in 2007. So it was still there was still influence there. So this question of where does all our data go and what does the government do and so on just already popped up. I was always very interested in tech. So I knew how to program, I knew how a computer works, and took every computer apart that ever existed in my around me and probably broke half of them thereby. So there was that interest, I think. And I think that is still what I see with a lot of privacy professionals, or also with people that work with noyb, where we have also a traineeship program and so on. One big thing is also understanding the factual side of it. How does a system, how does a database really work? How are these systems actually deciding over stuff? I think there's a lot to be gained also in that direction oftentimes. So for a lot of the trainees that we have at noyb, my biggest advice is usually to tell them do a programming course, just so that you know the factual pattern that you now as a lawyer should actually say something about. That is what I see a lot there, for example.
I certainly find that the best privacy lawyers, best privacy advisors are those who roll their sleeves up and get involved with the technology and they understand it truly.
And especially also in counseling or in advising people, because we see that ourselves if there is an IT person and a lawyer talking to each other and they both don't really understand each other's world. I oftentimes see them in a room and be like, you think you agree? Because you use the same words, but actually in your two bubbles, they mean something totally different, and you're actually in absolute disagreement right now. Yeah. You just don't know. And I think there is still a lot of that. And also to give good advice is to understand. It's like in business to a certain extent as well. You have to understand the business to give good legal advice in that area. And in the data or not just privacy. We have a much bigger IT law bubble, so to say. Knowing that helps a lot to also say, okay, as a practitioner, how do you implement a deletion policy? Is that possible? How can we, get consent for this, or how can we actually, implement that in reality, so that you're not the lawyer that also, constantly tells them what not to do, but maybe also to have some idea of how to implement that in practice. Or the other way around, we oftentimes see how the tech bubble is telling you, oh, it's encrypted or it's hashed, and it's all fine. It's not personal data anymore, and you're like, really,
go back to the text.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that is a big part. What we also see, I have to say, is very different cultures in the legal bubble. Obviously, we also have trainees and contacts, so to say. We do a lot in Ireland. So the common law approach is oftentimes a bit more. I'm coming from a very Germanic structured approach, so that is something that I always find very interesting. To really, for us, it's oftentimes a part to kind of go back to the law. What is the wording of it? What does it say? And I think there is still where also the education has shifted a bit, at least in what we see partly, towards more of having a good argument and a good presentation, a good overall essay written, but then not really following what the text of the law says anymore. And we see that especially in the Anglo-American sphere a bit more now, because we got trainees all over the place from all over Europe, which is also quite interesting because it's a very different approach to the issues, and sometimes we see that why do we argue 3 pages if they could possibly personal data if there is this one thing right here that you can use, or the specific text in the provision or so. So that's also interesting, working on a European level from our side, how the approaches are very different, and then also the regulators are different. Some of them want to have more the political background and explaining why that is all that important, and the other ones just want to have a very stringent paragraph, whatever is violated because of X, and what the bigger picture is no one cares about. So that's also the legal culture, I think, per country is extremely interesting in our work, because not a lot of organizations really work cross-country and really do strategic litigation as we do it, to think, okay, what is the upside of filing it in this country versus that versus the third one? And the US does that a lot with strategic litigation to actually think which, state do you use, which appeals court and which circuit and so on. But in the European Union, we actually have much graver differences, much more massive differences. Filing an appeal in Austria costs 30 euros, one in Ireland costs at least 100,000 euros. So there is much more to be gained to actually look across borders and get an idea. But it's also much more complicated because of all the languages, all the different traditions. So for us, that's a challenge, but also something that is super interesting to look into.
And thinking back to those early days, is there an event, a pivotal event that from then on you thought, I'm all in? It may be that you were working in the space, but there was a certain set of circumstances where you thought, I've got a future in here.
I think that was more gradual. And to be honest, I never really thought about my own future much. So that was definitely not a deciding factor. There was a part I was in exchange in Florida at like a little high school in the middle of nowhere. And there was CCTV cameras all over the place, police in school. And it was just I think one of the most prominent things in the afternoon was to do Future Farmers of America. So it was really not a drug, gang place or something, but you had all this surveillance. And that also went into, for example, the teachers having to clock in everything within 2 minutes. Everything had an ID. Everything was like you were a number to a large extent. I think coming from a country where we have exactly the opposite, at least in schools, that was very impressive to me to be like, okay, that feels weird somehow. Yeah. And that's cultural largely. I mean, it feels weird for Americans if I tell them we have at the law school oral exams and it depends on which one of the 10 professors you hit. And you get an F or an A, depending on whoever you end up with, which feels extremely unfair. So it's very different approaches, and that's also interesting. I think in the privacy bubble is a lot of privacy is cultural, of what we feel is private or not, or how far we go. And that was, for example, really interesting. Also, I worked a bit with intercultural learning. Mm-hmm. Be like, okay, it's really interesting how we have a fundamental right. But at the same time, it's extremely political. So I usually, or cultural, in a sense that I usually say, for example, we are very open about sexuality in Austria versus my American friends. So this idea of the Americans don't care about privacy, we do, is not always true for every topic. Like if it comes to sexuality, my American friends are like, too much information, please not. At the same time, in Austria, it would be crazy to ask someone, so how much are you worth and how much are you making? Like that's just something you're not talking about at all. Yeah. And that's interesting how there's different dimensions of that and how that plays out. And then obviously the whole fundamental rights doctrine on all of that is really interesting.
And from those early days to where you are today, what are you most proud of?
I'm generally not a person that is proud of things too much. I'm very much deficit oriented.
Glass half empty.
Yeah. I think generally what's interesting is that we kind of moved a lot with a very little budget. Most of this litigation came out of my own apartment, my student flat, so to say. And that is interesting if you kind of know your law well, if you know your arguments, you don't go too far. You're also self-critical in what you're arguing, which is one of the biggest problems of some of the big law firms. They just argue anything. Like our main opponent is, and we started to have a standard leaflet that we now send to the courts because it's always the same stuff that they just make up just to produce more pages. And if you don't have that and you know what you're saying, it gets you very far actually in at least the European system. And that was quite interesting. And not going too far in what you argue, which is one of the big problems, especially in the NGO bubble that just want to have, whatever they want as a political opinion. Separate your political opinion from the legal argument. Know your law, have the facts, and be solid on that. And then also if there's, tension, for example, that we also have in our legal teams, like when we went to the Court of Justice, generally that worked really, really well and it's a great team. But for example, there are certain situations where you just have to say that's not going to happen. And that is especially interesting, for example, in an intercultural element, because like as an Austrian, to me, it's crazy that there is a solicitor that talks to a barrister that talks to a court, and I'm in third person sitting somewhere back there, while in Austria, you sit at the same level as the judge and you just scream over if you feel like it. And a lot of that is done really interesting, how to manage that and how to, in these moments say, no, I know that's culturally different here, but I'm still insisting that this and that is done. And I think to bring these things together is quite interesting oftentimes and quite useful. Yeah.
there's obviously a lot of there's constraint in terms of budget, in terms of time as an NGO. It's you don't have a bottomless pit of money, so you do need to be focused, I imagine, and you need to make sure that every step you take is effective, because it's using the resources.
You have partly no clue how the NGOs work.
I was making assumptions about
partly. I wonder where foundations dump their money on.
But I wanted to ask. For somebody, and you mentioned earlier in the day that there were applicants for places, for jobs at none of your business. When you are doing that, what are you looking for? What for you? What is a mark of a good privacy advisor? And is it something that may be something useful for you, but maybe you'd say actually it's not so important if you're working in a different area of the field?
Yeah. So I think the biggest difference, most people that apply with us are usually in the compliance bubble otherwise, and they're usually not challenged. And you see that in job interviews that they hardly got a serious legal question ever. So we see really people starting to sweat in job interviews because they've never really had the law put in front of them and said, explain that paragraph to me.
Yeah.
And I think that's very specific in the privacy bubble that, some people really tell you that my job to a certain extent as a DPO at many companies, not all of them and not in all bubbles, but is to make sure that business can move on and this whole privacy thing doesn't stop anything. And we have people where literally, that's extreme examples, but you have the feeling they got hired for 100,000 when the GDPR kicked in, and then got 20,000 extra per year that they didn't, obstruct the business, and now they're 200,000 and think they're worth that. Once you actually ask them a GDPR question and there's just zero answer, you're sometimes wondering if there is not a very big bubble that grew partly, that didn't get questioned, that didn't really have to answer the tough questions. Now we're in litigation, so you always are going to be asked. Every millimeter you write, someone else is going to challenge it. Absolutely. And that's a very different bubble where it's not just that your boss wants that the business continues or that you do slight changes. You literally, whatever you say is going to be taken apart by the other side, with usually very well-paid lawyers on the other side. So that is what we're looking for mainly, is to really be precise, to know your stuff, to not go too far, which is for many people that apply for NGOs, they want to do the good thing, but may go too far to say, like, politically it would be great if this and that wouldn't be allowed.
Yeah.
But where's the text of the law that supports that? So we're in a very small bubble in the sense that we really do, it's comparable to consumer rights organizations, right, to really say, okay, we litigate and basically enforce the law. We're not a political organization, so we're not asking politics to change something or do something. We're just saying, okay, that is the law as it is. It with a very academic approach, I have to say. And now we're just making sure that we can enforce that. And that is a bit in between the NGO bubble that is oftentimes very political, very much, purpose-driven, have great ideas that I will support. But that's not litigation necessarily. And then on the other side, the DPO bubble that is oftentimes not challenged that much. And as long as your boss, is happy about it, you usually have a job in that bubble.
Yeah.
And I think that is going to be interesting how much that's going to mature. Because so far, and we also did research on that, a lot of the DPOs say, as long as there is not big fines, serious enforcement, I also have a hard time to tell my boss, you can't do that. And there is a legal view that says this is not possible, because they would rather just take the risk and say, if you're obstructing too much, you may be all very independent, but not have a job all that much anymore.
It does seemingly, through different number of factors, seem to be a chilling effect on the voices that are pro-privacy, whether within a business, outside.
Definitely, yeah.
I think we need to get the right mix so that actually there is enough care.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, I think we can also change some of the structures. I mean, already when the GDPR was negotiated, I was not a fan of having internal DPOs because we all knew how the dynamics are going to be.
Right, yeah.
In many companies, it depends. There are companies that have a very different company culture where that's really important and people are very well respected and do their thing. But especially at the problematic companies, that is usually not the culture that's there. So one option, for example, would be to have external review, just like we have it with financial accounting. It's not like an internal person reviewing reviewing the accounting. It's usually an external company that has to do that, and that is separate somehow. I mean, we do know how, I don't know, Wirecard was still approved by one of the big four. I forgot who it was. Yeah. And there can still stuff go wrong, but it's a more serious situation than we have right now. And I think some of that will probably over the next years will have to change structurally on how this is done. We'll definitely going to see more enforcement, or we need to see more enforcement. The political push there is definitely growing. So these roles may become more serious in the future as they were the first couple of years when the law came in. That's at least my hope. Let's see where we'll end up with that. And that will require people that are also very well trained, that, go the extra mile, that really dig into stuff and don't just do the 7-hour online IAPP course and then declare themselves to be a DPO on LinkedIn and very happily have everybody else join them in praises.
and thinking back to again where you started, if you were to have an opportunity to speak to a younger Max Schrems, what would you say to him?
Oh, think twice if you get engaged in all of this, because it's hard to get out again. I think largely a lot of the stuff we did, I would do in a very similar way again. There are, like, especially setting up, for example, an NGO is just a task that is I knew is major, but especially in the times that we're in, where it's really hard to find personnel, where we have the whole Corona drama, we have Ukraine, we have so many external factors that are on top of your daily business just dragging energy. I think that is a big challenge, and that is something that would have known 5 or 6 years ago that we're gonna, go more towards a world where stuff is not working that well, or where you run into external factors that come on top of your actual problem that you're trying to solve as an NGO. I probably would have sat there and thought twice about doing this or not. But now you're here and now you have to deal with it.
If a friend of yours came to you and said, look, Max, I've done a few courses and actually quite interested in this, what advice would you give them about maybe getting into a career in this area?
Again, I think the first big part is factual knowledge, really understanding technology. That is, no matter if you litigate or if you're defending or if you're trying to fix stuff, I think the core issue. It's hard to do, accidents or whatever if you've never seen a car. Like if you do that type of litigation, it's quite useful to know how that works. That's the first big part. I think the second big part is really go beyond the current standard in that field. The current standard is largely not really ideal. Many people get a quick job that is well paying. Like we have, my favorite is the IPP with the 7-hour online course, and it's even promoted in the US as like an online course. We get 100,000 usually thereafter. Mm-hmm. With a 7-hour course, I mean, you probably have to ask yourself, is that really like an equation that makes sense? and we do see that bubble, and maybe some of that dies off because a lot of that was also 2018. We needed it. They were just taken from somewhere. And I also see a lot of people just move on to other topics now. So there may be a bit of a core that stays on the topic. And really kind of this, I think, also serious understanding of the law and also broader understanding of the law. We have that in a lot of the litigation that they're like, yeah, but it's fine from a privacy perspective. I was like, yeah, but it violates criminal law. and so that is, we have cases like that right now where, they, for example, rerouted people from a free access request to a paid access request and just said you have to have the paid one, otherwise you can't use the data for something else, which is wrong. Mm-hmm. If you basically make millions off of that, that is fraud. And then you wonder who is the decision maker in that company that hasn't really thought about, having big things saying you're not allowed to use that, which is just factually wrong, and thereby make a lot of money to not think if that could potentially be an issue, at least under Austrian law. Yeah. And so I think this a bit more holistic part is also interesting. But again, it's cultural. It's different per country how stuff is organized. When I was studying in California, we were basically told you have 1 year of general legal studies. That's all you will know. And then you do 2 years of specialization and that's it. And you do a bar exam, and after 3 years, you're a lawyer. Very different than the Austrian approach, where we have about 5 years of constant failing. Like in Austria, there's only 2 grades. It's basically an F and a D. The others do not exist in reality. And it's very tough. And you have to retake exams until you finally know it. And you have to do a very broad part of the law and a very broad understanding of it. But that's later quite helpful to connect the dots and to have a broader picture or see repetitive issues. We still do a lot of Roman law, which I hated the first year. I was like, why the fuck do we do Roman law? But now you see that a lot of these core legal principles of, whoever has power over something then also has to have the liability thereafter. That is a principle for 2,000 years for good reasons. And once you're now in the digital age, you also can think about these things and then wonder why the GDPR, for example, exempts software vendors from the application of the law, because that's the people actually deciding the code and they're not covered by the law. And that is stuff that I think is useful for people to really excel and be really good at what they're doing, or be able to have this broader understanding, to have these basic things, even though I hated it a lot when I was a law student. But it's useful in the long run.
Max, thank you very much for joining the JPA.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.